Karban, who's come here from UC Davis. We're very lucky that finally we've been able to get the admin to allow us to bring people from the outside again. And he has done the courageous and amazing thing of studying plant communication and personality. So using the comparative method to explore topics that have more traditionally been studied in primates and birds, and we're creeping into other taxa, but now finally to plants. And so we're really happy to have him here. And I want to remind you about next week's talk, which is by Brett Beheim from Max Planck Evolutionary Anthropology. We don't have the budget to bring them that far yet. So he will be zooming in, and his talk is called Planck's Principle, Price's Theorem, and the Forces of Cultural Evolution. I thought he was going to talk about Shamani data, but he's mainly working with various data sets, historical archives of human culture, things like board games and music and all kinds of interesting cultural data sets. And so looking at recruitment, inheritance, and demography and cultural change, and doing some fancy modeling to bring all these forces together and evaluate the strength of these different forces in shaping cultural change. And he will be having individual appointments spread throughout the week due to his time difference. Once again, I want to thank the Anthropology Department, the Dean of Social Sciences, the Department of Communication, and various private donors for making this series possible, especially in these rough financial and bureaucratic times. So he can talk about his work better than I can, so we'll turn it over right now to Rick.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here.
Yes, thanks for inviting me. Yeah. So today I'm going to try to convince you that if you've considered plants to be kind of uninteresting organisms that really don't have any behavior, they just kind of sit there and don't do anything, that those ideas are really quite wrong, and that in fact plants exhibit a lot of behaviors, including what we might consider to be communication and personality. And I will say right at the outset that these are terms that are maybe you're comfortable with thinking about humans as exhibiting personalities and communicating. Other animals, maybe, but plants, almost certainly not. And I'm not especially wedded to these terms, so that if you want to argue that without brains, plants couldn't possibly do these kinds of things, communicate, have personalities, I'm fine acknowledging that. I think that what I'd like to convince you of is that plants are faced with very similar kinds of evolutionary pressures, and they have responded, they have evolved processes that I think are pretty analogous to the things that animals do, and maybe to some things that in the past or perhaps in the present you have considered are only in the kind of purview of humans. So I am somebody who really likes fieldwork, and if I'm studying plant communication, that has often meant studying, since plants do not vocalize, it has, in our case, generally involved looking at plant chemistry. And I did not like chemistry when I took it as an undergraduate. I have thought, oh, perhaps I'm more interested in it now. Not the case. I have not enjoyed my little forays into plant chemistry. And so I've been lucky to shows on my screen. There we go. That's kind of strange. Okay, I've been lucky to work with a bunch of really excellent collaborators, and these four are the collaborators who are most relevant to this talk. James, Cowrie, and Patrick have all done a lot of the chemical analyses that will show up in my talk. Cowrie and Patrick in particular have done a lot of field work with me. Charlene is somebody who worked on chipmunks and was interested in chipmunk personalities, and we got to talking about, plants might do things that are pretty similar to the kinds of things that she was finding for chipmunks. And so when I get to the personality part of the talk, I've done that in collaboration with Charlene and Patrick. So in this talk, I will consider these four questions. Do plants communicate about herbivory? What is a personality? Do individual plants have personalities? And if they do, why should we care? Why does it matter? So let's start with the first question. Do plants communicate about herbivory? And this has been let's try this one. Nope. There we go. This has been controversial, and I'm not exactly sure why. I don't really understand why this idea has been so kind of provocative and annoying to a lot of plant biologists. We've known forever that plants are very sensitive to their environments. And so, for instance, these tobacco plants are exquisitely sensitive to the quality and quantity of light that they are receiving. When they are shaded, they tend to grow much taller. When they're getting a lot of light, they tend not to elongate, but to become much bushier. And anyone who's had a house plant and stuck it in their window has seen that plants are very sensitive to the direction of incoming light. And the physiological underpinnings of these light responses are very well known. The fitness consequences of the ability to perceive and respond to light are very well known. But for some reason, the idea that plants are also sensitive to other kinds of cues in their environment, cues that indicate a greater or lesser risk of getting attacked by insect herbivores, has been far more controversial. So I would just like to sort of take you through the evidence that I think is, to my mind, quite convincing that plants do communicate about herbivores. And when I use the term communication, what I am meaning is that I'm using the term communication to indicate that a sender individual emits a cue that can be perceived by a receiver individual, and it causes that receiver to change its phenotype in ways that make sense. And some animal behaviorists want to call this eavesdropping on the part of the receiver, and I agree that if some animal behaviorists feel that communication should really, the term should really be reserved for those instances where there's intent. And so for people, maybe we can get at intent. For animals, that becomes very difficult, impossible to really understand intent. And for plants, it becomes kind of ridiculous. So I'm going to use the term communication without implying anything about intent and without implying anything about the fitness consequences of this transfer of information. Although I'll show you in a little bit that being able to perceive and respond to cues about risk of damage is, at least in my system, associated with some benefits in performance, if not in fitness. Okay, so if I'm interested in testing for communication between plants, and in my case, I have been working primarily with sagebrush plants, and I've done most of this work in the field. And in the field, I have pairs of sagebrush bushes that are growing quite close to one another. And I have 3 experimental treatments. This treatment that I call clipped, and in the upper left here, and in this treatment, I go in and with scissors, just at the beginning of the season, clip some of the leaves of a branch on my clip plant. And then throughout the rest of the growing season, I measure how much damage a neighboring branch that is on a different plant accrues, how much it gets eaten over the growing season. So this is my clip treatment. I also have a treatment that I call clipped and bagged, shown on the upper right. And in this treatment, I do the same thing. I cut a few leaves with scissors, but then I immediately put a plastic bag around the clipped branch, reducing the likelihood that volatile chemicals can move from the clipped branch to the neighboring plant. And then I have an unclipped control. And in each of these cases, what I'm measuring is the amount of damage on an assay branch, on a different plant that is close to the branch that got clipped. And we've now done these experiments a bunch of times. And this is generally what we find, that the y-axis here is the amount of damage by insects to the assay branch, and it's reduced for those plants that are growing close to a clipped branch. When the clipped branch is bagged, there's no reduction in damage relative to the control. This suggests that a volatile cue is involved. And we have a lot more evidence that I'll show you in a little bit that, in fact, the cue that is moving between plants is a volatile chemical. So, as I said, we've done these sorts of experiments a lot of times over a lot of different growing seasons. And we know a lot of kind of details about how this works in the field. Sagebrush plants, this work is done on the east side of the Sierras, largely at Snarl and Valentine, 2 field stations that are near Mammoth Lakes, and then another UC field station, Sachem Creek, that's north of Truckee. So all of these field stations are on the east side of the Sierras. they're all in places that have been protected from fires for decades. And these kinds of conditions have favored pretty much sagebrush monocultures. So sagebrush often has other sagebrush neighbors, and we have found that we can measure or we can document effects of communication up to a distance of about 60 centimeters. And sagebrush often has, almost all individuals have neighbors within 60 centimeters. We found that young plants are both the best emitters and receivers. In the experiment that I showed you in the cartoon, we set up the treatments by clipping the plants with scissors. We do just as well setting up the treatments by putting real herbivores or bagging real herbivores on the plants and letting them do the damage. That's a lot more work. In almost all of the experiments, maybe all of the experiments that I'll describe going forward, we've set up our treatments using scissors. We are, if we get an infection in one part of our body, we have the ability to move white blood cells throughout our vascular system. And plants certainly have vascular systems that they use to move water and nutrients from one part of the plant to another. But it turns out that plants are not very good at coordinating systemic defenses using this vascular system. And we found this out by doing an experiment that was fairly similar to the one that I described a few minutes ago. But in this case, we used branches, experimental branches and assay branches that were on the same individual. So in this case, we clipped this branch, and then we measured how much damage the neighboring assay branch received throughout the rest of the growing season. So in this case, there's the opportunity for both volatile communication between these two branches and vascular communication. They're right next to each other, so they are attached by a stem. We did the same thing where we bagged the treatment branch right after we clipped it. And so here, there's much less of an opportunity for volatile communication, but there's still an opportunity for vascular communication, and then we have a control. And what you can see is that in this experiment, just like in the experiment where we had two different bushes, we only see evidence of communication, and we only see a reduction in damage to the assay branch where volatiles were allowed to go between the two branches. And so one of the things that we've worried about is, like, how did this communication between individuals evolve, and why are they doing this, essentially? And one explanation that makes some sense to us is that communication that we observe between different individuals evolved for the plant to coordinate its own systemic defenses. And it's not very good at doing this using vascular connections. It's much better at doing this using a volatile information exchange. So up to this point, we have kind of waved our arms about what is moving between plants or what the potential language of communication might be. And we've been very interested in trying to figure out, well, what is the language of communication? What is the language that these plants are using? And as I mentioned, I don't do any of this volatile chemistry. This is work that James Bland did with us at the field site. And all of these various peaks represent different compounds that the sagebrush emits when it is damaged with scissors. And I guess the take-home message here is that, there are a lot of peaks. This is potentially very complicated. We've done other experiments. Both James and Cowrie have been really intent on trying to figure out which of these peaks is the biological signal, which of these peaks is the language. And the results are pretty frustrating. They're inconsistent from one season to the next. So we don't know any more about the language now than we, I can just add a period there. The language seems to be complicated, and we don't have much of a handle at all about which are the chemicals that are involved in this communication. So I hope I've convinced you that plants are communicating, that plants are eavesdropping on volatile cues that are emitted by their neighbors and by other branches. What I would like to do is consider what the consequences of this eavesdropping might be. And sagebrush is kind of a fun plant, I think, to work with. It is very aromatic. It grows in places I like to go spend my summers at. It's very slow growing. In most years, it doesn't reproduce at all. I've been working in this system since 1995, and during this period of time, I've only seen 4 recruitment events. 4 times when seedlings were established. We've been really interested in trying to understand the fitness consequences of this communication. This shows the first of those recruitment events that happened in 2010. This is probably not a terribly good image for you, but the story here is that the ground between bushes was just like a carpet of sagebrush seedlings. And we were really excited. We hadn't seen this before. So we decided to stop everything, stop the experiments that we had planned, and just see what happens to those seedlings. And does it matter to them if they are receiving these cues, these volatile cues, or not? And so in fact, both 2010 and 2011 were recruitment events. And what you can see is that most of the seedlings didn't make it through their first summer. The vast majority of them died, but seedlings were about 10 times as likely in both of these years to survive if they had clipped neighbors rather than unclipped neighbors. So for seedlings, there seems to be potentially some advantage to responding to this information. If we consider established adult plants, what we have found is that these plants, these adults, produce more new branches and more inflorescences if they are receiving cues from clipped neighbors early in the season, suggesting that this kind of communication may be of benefit to the plants. And granted, these are pretty poor proxies of plant fitness, and sagebrush really is not the system that you would want to ask questions about fitness, because, as I mentioned, it's very slow growing and doesn't often reproduce. Nonetheless, this is the best we can do to answer that question. Okay, so communication maybe is going on between these plants and maybe is of some benefit to them. Do they have personalities? So let's back up for a moment and let me tell you how I'm using this term personality. When I use the term, I'm referring to a behavioral tendency among individual plants that is consistent over time and is consistent over ecological situations. And there are lots of very cool examples of animals that have personalities. So for instance, among these sea lions, some individuals are consistently more aggressive than others, and this tendency to be aggressive is consistent over time. Similarly, for communication, for animals that engage in alarm calls, these marmots show calling personalities. Some individuals are bolder than others. Bold individuals are less likely to emit alarm calls, but when they do, other individuals in the population pay more attention to those calls, so that there are good examples of personalities among organisms that use alarm calls that are consistent over time and also consistent over different situations. So for instance, individual song sparrows that are more likely to respond to alarm calls were also the individuals that were more likely to issue alarm calls. Okay, do plants show these kinds of personalities, these kinds of consistent behavioral traits that are repeatable over time, and we'll consider that first, and that are repeatable over different ecological situations? In order to answer this question, we tried to measure variation among receivers. In order to do this, we experimentally clipped. So in these experiments, we're using much larger plants. In all of the experiments that I described previously, we went out of our way to use relatively young, small plants. These are much larger plants, and we are clipping various branches on the same plant and then exposing those volatiles, transferring those volatiles to a bunch of different receivers. And in this cartoon, I have 5 different receivers. In the experiment, we actually moved those volatiles to 10 different receivers for each emitter plant. And we did this by clipping the sagebrush plants, allowing the volatiles to collect in a plastic bag, then using a giant syringe, sucking up the volatiles, moving them to other individuals, and incubating those other individuals with the volatiles that we collected. And so we were able to do these transfers pretty easily. We also were interested in asking if there's variation among emitters. And again, we kind of use the same technique where we have the same receiver plant, but different branches on that receiver plant we inoculate with the volatiles of damaged branches from different emitters. So we can compare how effective are different emitters at communicating and causing a reduction in the damage of the various receiver branches. And here's what we found. There was consistent variation among individual receivers. The identity of the receiver explained about 60% of how much damage it received during a season. So a lot of the identity of the receiver was really important. This isn't so surprising because, sure, different plants are in different locations. They have different experiences, so that finding a large effect among receivers, a lot of variation explained by the identity of the receiver, is not particularly surprising. It'd be hard to imagine a scenario where this wasn't the case. What was much more surprising to us was this result, that there was significant variation, albeit it didn't explain as much variation, but there was still significant variation explained in the identity of the emitter. Some emitters were just much better than others at causing their neighbors to increase their levels of resistance. In year one, some plants or some combinations of plants were found to be, really good at communicating, and others were found to be really poor at communicating. We wondered if these pairs that were really good at communicating, would that be consistent from year to year? So we did these transfers. We worked with combinations that were good communicators in year one, and sure enough, they were good communicators in year two. Those plants that were poor communicators in year one were also poor communicators in year two. The pairs that were poor communicators were no better than controls that had not received any cue. The plants that were good communicators did not induce resistance nearly as well as plants that were themselves actually clipped. Nonetheless, they were better than the combinations of plants that were poor communicators. So that being a good communicator was consistent from one year to the next. So that's some consistency over time. What about over different situations? What we found was that good receivers also tended to be good emitters, so that there was some consistency across different situations in how well these plants communicated. So hopefully, at this point, if you are willing to buy my definition of communication, or of personality, hopefully I've convinced you that there are these consistent behavioral tendencies among individual plants. I think it's worth kind of asking, well, okay, so what? Why does this matter? There are several potential reasons why this might be important. At least my background is as an ecologist. And as an ecologist, what we tend to do is to look at a whole bunch of different individuals and maybe subject all of those individuals to a particular treatment, and then look at kind of the mean tendency of all of those individuals. And this is focusing, this is causing us to shift the kinds of questions that we're asking. And that shift is from looking at differences between individuals to looking at differences within an individual across different times or across different situations. And it's unclear to me, maybe that's already like the mindset of behaviorists, psychologists, but this shift seems like, ooh, that's really quite a different way to ask questions than ecologists usually do. So a shift from different individuals to the same individual in different contexts. Past experiences are also clearly going to be important. And I think that thinking about what's happening to individuals over time really forces us to acknowledge that that these personal histories are really important. And again, that I'm not at all sure. That might be like not at all surprising to this audience, but I think it really is not something that at least ecologists acknowledge very much. The third thing here is that I think it forces us to focus on correlated behaviors. Whoops, wrong direction. So if we want to understand, if we want to explain a particular behavior that we see, we might well trying to just understand that behavior in sort of a atomized way is likely to give us either a misleading answer or an answer that doesn't make a lot of sense. And that if we want to understand one behavior, we might really need to consider what other traits are correlated with that behavior. Yeah, like I say, it's unclear to me if any of this will strike you as particularly insightful or not. But at least for an ecologist, it is asking for a little bit of a shift. So in conclusion, I would say that I sort of have three take-home messages. The first is that if you kind of came to the talk thinking that plants don't do a lot of behavior, they just kind of sit there. I hope I've convinced you that that's not at all the case, that plants are capable of like really quite sophisticated behaviors. They're anticipating future situations. They're changing, albeit slowly compared to animals, in a lot of pretty interesting ways. And one of those ways is that they are communicating about herbivory. They are sensitive to environmental cues that provide information, reliable information, about their risk of getting eaten. Secondly, that this kind of eavesdropping can increase plant performance. And finally, that individual plants exhibit personalities, and that acknowledging these personalities maybe will get us thinking about things in a slightly different way. So that's what I've got, and I would be happy to answer questions that you might have, or even happier to have you suggest things that are obvious to behaviorists, but that plant people haven't yet considered. So thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you for such an interesting talk. It's very thought-provoking for human brain. So I was just curious. So just so I understand that, so the cue that these plants in the experiments received was the idea that they would have been chopped by an herbivore, but then the response is protection against insects.
Oh yeah, sorry.
So there seems
I use
disconnect.
herbivore and insect. So like anything that eats leaves, I call an herbivore.
Okay.
And insects are the main herbivores. And for reasons that are still not clear to me, I was hired in an entomology department. And so I try to, I try to work with insect herbivores when I can.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's
Yeah.
Were there any particular characteristics of good emitters and receivers, and any particular characteristics of bad emitters and receivers?
Yeah. We looked at a bunch of traits that, sort of seemed obvious. We all know what we're looking for. So, are they different sizes? Are the leaves different colors? Are the leaves different sizes? None of the things that were obvious to us to ask turned out to be very informative, with the exception of young plants. As plants age, they become less able to communicate, both as emitters and receivers, and also over the course of the growing season. To some extent, these results are misleading because I sort of presented them as if, oh yeah, sagebrush can always do this. Not at all the case. The initial damage has to happen quite early in the growing season, when sagebrush is metabolically most active, for us to see any of this kind of cool stuff. But those are the only two things that we know. The plants have to be kind of metabolically really active, and communication is better among young individuals.
Was there an ideal age, or you saw it tapering off?
Yeah, we don't really know how to age the plants. So this is like, these things live, I don't know, 50 years, 100 years, this kind of thing. So we found, I think pretty early on, that we were getting better results when we used sort of small, really healthy looking plants. And by and large, we've focused our attention. Like once we figured that out, then, oh, okay, we're not going to mess with these older plants. Let's give ourselves the best chance of finding cool, interesting results. But we don't really know how old these plants are.
So does the composition of the volatiles, change then
Yeah,
depending from plant to
the
plant? And then does that have an impact on how they're communicating?
Yeah, so the composition of the volatiles does not change for a given plant over time. But if we look at these peaks, so James and Cowrie take the plants, run them through a GCMS, and get this cool spectrum. And different plant individuals show different peaks. And plant individuals communicate most effectively with other individuals that have the same set of peaks. So it's almost as if the plants are exhibiting different dialects, and plants are communicating most effectively with other individuals that use the same dialect. And these dialects, we call them chemotypes. Chemotypes are highly heritable. So maybe there's kin selection, this whole so I've gotten really interested in these different dialects, and it looks as if that the dialects are responding to different environmental conditions, so that elevation, the dialects seem to sort out by elevation much more effectively than they do by geographic location. So in any given place, there can be only a single dialect, or there can be like 8 of them. But one dialect is really common at the highest populations, like up and down the east side of the Sierras. And then a little bit lower down, another dialect seems to become more common. Yes?
Could you expand a bit more about the environment in which these experiments are happening? And then are you taking any measure, like what measures of, say, like soil nutrition, et cetera, are you maybe calculating into?
Yeah. So I don't have a lot to say about that. Like these experiments have been done, near these. Most of the experiments have been done, near these 3 UC field stations. They're at anywhere from like 6,500 feet to like 8,000 feet on the east side of the Sierras. I've not, I guess I've done a little bit of, again, I don't do any of the soil stuff myself. And I also have done most of this without much of a budget, so that I've had like the crudest of soil analyses done that haven't been very informative, but I wouldn't rule out the idea that soil nutrients could be involved in, like elevation is easy for me to measure, soil nutrients less so. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if some of these dialects or the ability to communicate at all is related to the nutritional status of the plants, but I don't know.
I was just thinking, like, are there other, my husband's an arborist, so I get to hear a lot about this, but are there other sources of like stress, I guess maybe like rainwater, like average rainfall might be, and temperature might be things that you could measure, or like any sudden changes in those that could be like adding to or changing how these plants are communicating with one another?
Yeah.
And or if you have theories about, you know, obviously insects are one possible threat that these plants might want to communicate about, but are there others that they could be communicating?
Yeah, I would guess that there probably, are, we know that they're communicating about light levels, for instance. And people have been very interested in the idea that plants might be responding to sounds and music, and if you play rock music, your plants will grow. Okay, a lot of people have tried to do that experiment in a controlled, replicated manner and never found any evidence that plants care about the quality of music that they're receiving. And I mean, it kind of makes sense that if just we think about what matters to these plants, light, water, if something comes along and eats all their leaves, those are things that, I don't know, it just kind of makes sense that they are going to respond to those environmental cues. And people have found that all of those things, that plants are sensitive to all of those kinds of cues, not necessarily in a context of communication, but in a context of, just being sensitive to environmental cues and responding in ways that make a lot of sense. Yes?
So you mentioned that the plants who receive the cue have less damage. What exactly was the damage that you were measuring? Was it the number of leaves even? Was it oxidative stress?
Yeah. So I've attempted to measure lots of kind of damage categories. And what I was showing was all leaf biomass removed. So how much leaf chewing has occurred. And it is the only one of the responses that shows kind of interesting patterns. So yeah, I've looked at how many aphids, sucking insects, or that kind of thing. Not in this system, but I've also done a bunch of this work with wild tobacco that grows on the east side of the Sierras. And wild tobacco that gets that receives the cues from damaged sagebrush plants increases its own defenses against chewing herbivores, which that's kind of weird that there's this communication between species. Those tobacco plants that increase resistance against insects become much more susceptible to frost damage and cold damage. But that's about all I know. Let me go in the back and then we'll come back.
So the language of cue is interesting just because it seems like it's a bit of information that the other plants are responding to. Is it possible that these have some sort of independent effect, for instance, that they're just independently beneficial to the plants, these volatile chemicals? Or actually just the idea that, or maybe they're just independently unattractive to the insects that might eat them, so that when they disperse, they get onto the other plants, it has one of these either beneficial or just
so there is evidence that this is the case, and by this is the case, the volatiles are themselves repellent to some of the insects, and we have evidence that when the plants receive these volatile cues, they produce a whole bunch of other metabolites that are also involved in, that have kind of classically been involved in resistance to insects. So there does seem to be like some real kind of communication that then causes a change in the plant that makes it more resistant. But there also is evidence that the volatiles themselves are repellent. And we've gotten a bunch of, like one of the things that we're doing kind of at the moment is asking, since there are these dialects, we've been interested in asking, well, what happens if you're a plant and you're the wrong dialect? You're surrounded by plants that are not the same dialect as you. And you're stuck there. You live your entire life in this one place, surrounded by these same neighbors. Do you get better at responding to those neighbors? And the answer is yes, you do. Which, whoa, this is cool, like some kind of learning? Maybe, maybe not. An alternative explanation is that, and there's some evidence that these volatiles get stuck on the surface of the plant and then re-emitted. And so it's possible that there's some sort of threshold and that the plant needs to get enough of these like neighbor volatiles stuck on it, and then it effectively re-emits them and gets the benefit of this sort of deterrence. And we're not sure, like, well, what's the relative importance of kind of these two different mechanisms? Yeah.
I had a question. Thank you for your talk. I work part of the time with herders in the Himalayas, like cordyceps, and climate change is inhibiting the growth of the cordyceps. And then the herders are collecting the cordyceps, and that's like their main source of income. And I'm just trying to see different ways of thinking about this. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions, I guess, in terms of your own research, like how these plants might be communicating, or plants that have been harvested, and also climate type change, and how a plant might communicate or react to these things.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I wish I did. People have speculated that the situation that we see in the Great Basin now, where sagebrush, is often like this monospecific stand, that that's a little bit unnatural. That sagebrush is a plant that does really poorly if it's trying to regrow after a fire. Oh, we haven't had those in 100 years. And it is a plant that does really well if there's overgrazing. Oh, we have had a lot of that. And so an argument has been made that, at least in this situation, the kind of human-induced weirdness has set up a situation that maybe these plants didn't evolve with. Yeah, that all sounds reasonable to me. Like, how will climate change affect communication? And I don't know. I mean, I think those are really good questions. I don't feel like I have anything to add to that at this point. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just wanted to follow up a little on the question raised earlier about the possibility that there's an effect of the volatiles on insects themselves, causing them to avoid areas that are clipped. Is there, or nearby, in nearby beds possibly, is there any work that you've done looking at or trying to measure insect abundance with and without clipping to get a sense of what effect size the insect's behavior could be involved in this?
Yeah. So I think that, I wish I could remember exactly sort of for different herbivores. So the two main herbivores in this system are a bunch of grasshoppers and these little leaf beetles. And they are definitely affected by the volatiles. Like what is the relative effect size? I don't think we know. And if we do, this is stuff that really Patrick Groff-Tiza has been working on, and I don't remember exactly what he has found in terms of relative effect size, except that there's evidence for kind of both of those. There are a lot of people who have been interested in the idea that these volatiles are used by the predators and parasites of the herbivores, and that the plant is essentially putting out an SOS call for help from these higher trophic levels. And I've looked for that explicitly and not found any evidence for it, and kind of poo-pooed it in the literature. And I also like work in a department where there are a lot of people who are really interested in this idea. Like, I'm tired of hearing about it.
Yeah.
So that, being a bit of a contrarian, that was interesting to me. But more recently, I have found that one of these beetle populations that I was working with got completely done in, completely trashed by ladybug, coccinellid beetles. So it has made me kind of rethink that. I'm like, oh yeah, maybe sometimes, yeah. Yes.
Or plants that got better with time when surrounded by other plants that sort of had the same dialect, and they were like the outsider plants. Did those outsider plants get better at receiving and emitting, or both? Or how is that differentiated from them? Like, was it the measure that they were getting better at receiving and emitting, or the measure was that they received less damage? Because I was wondering if that less damage could just be by the fact that sort of pellets and insects around them.
Yeah, the only thing we have measured is we have compared plants that are plants that have been surrounded by another chemotype and plants that are not surrounded by that other chemotype. And when we artificially bring in the volatiles of the other chemotype, the plants that have spent their lives surrounded by them responded better than those that were not surrounded by them. This is kind of a little bit where we're going now, and so that's as far as we've taken that. But I like those ideas a lot. Yes.
And maybe you just kind of answered it this last one, but so is any of your research maybe showing that neighbors of neighbors are also getting these cues?
Yeah, we haven't looked at this kind of neighbors of neighbors. There is a paper, I think it is about drought stress, that has found this kind of, I think the title of the paper might be Rumor Has It, where the sort of a focal plant is given drought stress, its neighbors become better at responding to drought stress, and then the neighbors of those plants. That's, yeah, the only example. There are people who are skeptical of this. We haven't tried it in our system at all, but it's a cool idea again. Yes?
Two unrelated points. First, I don't know anything about sagebrush reproduction, but you sort of passingly mentioned kin selection, and is their dispersal pattern so localized that conceivably this is a signal and not a cue, that is they're warning their relative?
Yeah, I like this idea. Other people have looked at the sort of buzzword for this is genetic structure. So people have looked at the genetic structure of sagebrush populations, in fact, and found that they don't disperse very far, and that nearby individuals tend to be quite strongly related. And so I very much like the idea that kin selection could be involved. Sagebrush individuals, so I've compared how effective communication is between individuals that are closely related versus individuals that are complete strangers. And they do communicate much more effectively with kin than they do with strangers.
Interesting. So a totally unrelated point, which is you're talking about personality, right? And patterns of behavior across contexts, right? Not to take anything away from the really impressive work that you've done, but emitting the volatile cue and responding to the volatile cue, one can see those as different behaviors, but particularly when at least the ancestral trait seems to be the plant communicating with itself, as it were, it's a within system, then arguably these are different facets of the same behavior. So at least certainly in humans, and I think in a lot of the animal behavior work, when we talk about a disposition of personality, we mean that the individual responds with similar patterns across quite different contexts. And so I study, among other things, risk-taking in human beings. And we know that if people are prone to take risks with their physical safety in one domain, they're prone to do it in many other domains as well, right? So, they engage in recreational activities that are risky. They probably also engage in sexual activities that are risky. They probably also, take fewer health precautions and so on, right? And I have long thought, and this is not a sagebrush question, so forgive me, I realize you're a sagebrush guy, but you said you want ideas, right?
Yeah.
And I have long thought that deciduous plants are gambling, right? They're making a decision as to when they shed their leaves, so that, you can benefit by keeping your leaves on longer, but you run the risk of storm damage, right?
Yeah,
or you can
for
play it
sure.
safe and drop your leaves early, but you don't grow as much, right?
Yeah.
It struck me that one possible way of determining whether that's a personality in this sense is that if the plant that keeps its leaves longer also has thicker, stronger branches, then that's not a behavior at all. It's just phenotypic quality. It can afford that, right? But if the risk-taking plant is the one that grows fast, has thin branches, and keeps its leaves on a long time, then it's taking gambles across sort of two domains, right? How it grows its branches and how long it keeps its leaves on, right? And those are pretty different, and they put it at risk, right? They enhance the risk. So I don't know whether there are any sagebrush analogies to this. I mean, it's a small, slow-growing plant. It's not deciduous. But whether there's work on deciduous plants that looks at whether this is just phenotypic quality or risk-taking personality.
Yeah, this gives me a lot to think about. So sagebrush loses many of its leaves. It has kind of two kinds of leaves, those that it holds through the winter, and then many leaves that it sheds. And I've never thought to pay attention to that behavior in different individuals, let alone to see how it correlates with some of the risk-taking that they do with herbivory. But I like that idea quite a bit.
Do they suffer storm damage if they don't drop those leaves that they can't shed?
I don't know. Yeah, not in the same way that a lot of trees, get ice on them and they crack. I've been just sort of coincidentally very interested in this leaf shedding business. And valley oaks show a lot of individual variation in how much they shed. So some valley oaks hold their leaves through the winter, others get rid of them. Yeah, that might be, like, again, I haven't thought this through, but that might be a cool system to see what those tendencies are correlated with.
And keeping with the argument that it's across domains, that it's diagnostic of personality, right?
Yeah.
So just like the person who, goes skydiving probably doesn't go to the dentist very often, right? The plant that hangs onto its leaves longer is maybe less responsive to signals of herbivory from neighbors,
Yeah.
right? Because it's gambling a lot,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so,
yeah.
presumably there's a cost to producing these volatiles and the resistance that they convey, otherwise the plants would produce them all the time.
Yeah.
And so the conservative approach is be very responsive to what your neighbors are doing. If there's any indication that herbivory is occurring, put up the firewalls, get your defenses up, right? The risky behavior is, screw it, I'm gonna keep growing and not worry about,
Yeah.
possible herbivory, right?
Yeah.
So if I hang on to my leaves, and I mean, you said these plants go up to 8,000 feet, presumably they're heavy snow loads at that level.
Yeah, even the plants, at the low elevations are largely covered by snow, but I think that it's easier, it's less dangerous to be covered by snow than to be out in the open. The snow both buffers temperatures and buffers wind and all of that kind of damage, but yeah.
Either these or the valley oaks that they, the ones that hang onto their leaves pay less attention to their neighbors. Right?
Yeah. That's cool stuff. I will think about it. Yes.
Did you understand it correctly that to characterize a good responder, you're considering how much damage they suffer? You're not trying to determine directly if there is some response, chemical response. Is this right?
That is right. So we know that there are chemical responses that are associated with not getting a lot of damage. Those are not the responses that I have measured and shown you in these slides. So you're absolutely right in pointing out that being a good responder in these slides is not getting damage, rather than upregulating production of particular chemicals. And it would be really nice. I mean, people do not like my calling these plants more resistant and that kind of thing, because I'm using this, very crude sort of bioassay of resistance, rather than measuring particular chemical responses. And this field is kind of dominated by people who are far more mechanistic. I am way out there on, at one extreme, and the rest of my field is similarly unhappy with me for this very reason.
Not okay.
Yes.
I don't know if I missed it, so this might be, but I guess I was just wanting to hear more about the actual process of emitting these volatiles. Like, is it something that, is it like it comes off of an injury and it goes down over time? Is it something, because you had mentioned also that it's related to a very particular part of the metabolic cycle, so I was just wondering about this.
Yeah, it is exactly that. It's related to an injury. It decreases over time. It's not clear in this system. These sort of induced responses have been studied now in lots of different systems, and in some of those systems, it's quite clear that the responses are kind of de novo production of new volatiles or de novo production of new, we'll put them in air quotes here, defensive chemicals. That's less clear in my system, largely because, I don't know, that's kind of above my pay grade. Yes.
Hi. Thanks for letting us think about plants for a while. So, thinking about the personalities. And you mentioned genetic structure on potentially an altitudinal gradient. Is that sort of what it
Yeah,
looks
well,
like?
genetic structure, just even on a geographic.
Horizontal as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, again, I did not do the geographic structure work. The people who have done it on a geographic, and I don't know that elevation was included in those studies at all. So on a pretty small scale. We're at about the distance that 2 sagebrush plants might grow.
Okay.
And we are much more likely to be related than somebody in that corner or somebody at the edge of the building. Like at that scale, there's a lot of genetic structure.
Got it. Okay, so you mentioned 2 main insect herbivores.
Yeah.
Do they show an altitudinal gradient in where they exist? Or are they across the swath of the
Yeah.
plant's range?
They are across the range, across the elevational range, but they, at least over this period of time, they have been far more abundant, far more damaging at the high elevation.
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh, I can see that.
yeah.
Okay. Because then, all right, thank you for that. Because then I was thinking about how you mentioned when you bring a plant, or you're not bringing, but when a plant is not related to the plants around it, that's where I get a little bit muddled, because I'm wondering, so bringing together the ideas of potentially different herbivory selective pressures across the landscape, genetic structure within the population where you have plants who are closer together and more closely related, and then trying to tease apart this idea of, is it the environmental cues or is it the underlying genomic architecture of those related plants that influence the cues that the plants are emitting? And so I don't think that you do any manipulation experiments with moving physical plants.
We have done this.
Okay.
We've potted plants and moved them around. Yeah.
And does it take a period of time then? Have you measured chemical emittances over several years, and do they eventually catch up? Because then you're getting, I mean, you said you weren't a mechanism guy, but so maybe this is too mechanistic. But then you're getting at this idea of, is it the environment that's leading to the cues, or is it something in the plant?
Yeah, kind of the common garden, common environment
Right.
Yeah, we have definitely tried this. And so we can, take these plants, put them in pots, water them, bring them back to Davis, keep them happy. But we've tried to do this, like to do a bunch of transplants in the field. And if we, keep the plants in pots and then, water them twice a week kind of thing, we can keep them happy and we can do these experiments. But when we put them in the ground, like sagebrush, when it germinates, it's like, yay big above ground, and it's like yay below ground. Like that's what it does right away. It just goes down to try to keep up. Almost all of the growth, like the early season stuff, and when we do all of our treatments, it's right at snow melt when there's a lot of water that's available. And they are racing with the drying soil, just to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper faster than the soil is drying out. And so our ability, even when we try to do these transplants at snowmelt and then water them, yeah, it doesn't work in the field.
Yeah. You can really get at that.
Yeah.
I kind of thought you were really there.
Yes.
Were you able to establish a maximum distance that the emitter plants were able to sort
Yeah.
of communicate? So to speak?
Yeah.
So
So
I'm
we.
curious about how roots, the proximity of roots factor in.
Oh yeah. I don't know how the roots factor into this, but we found that up to about 60 centimeters, we got a good response. And then beyond 60 centimeters, no response. And it wasn't like some kind of nice curve. It was just like an all or nothing threshold. People often ask me about, well, are the roots in contact? And could some of this communication be going on underground? I think that is certainly a possibility. We can get essentially the same effect if we pot the plants up so that there's no root contact, but there's just air contact. So I don't know that there's no communication between roots or between fungal connections, but I do know that it's not required. Somebody this way, yes. Oh, sorry.
I was gonna have a question, you already answered
I mean, I have both. So I was just wondering if about the complexity of communication between different types of plants. So when we think of animal communication, there are certain features of different clades of animals that are usually associated with a greater versus lesser degree of complexity in communication. So I mean, I'm a total novice in this area. Like, do trees that are long-lived and giant have extremely complex languages and systems of communication, and where the sagebrush sort of falls? It seems like it's a small but long-lived plant, so various axes at play.
Yeah, so a while back we did a meta-analysis we collected somewhere like about 50 examples of communication among plants. And we thought, okay, there are enough examples now, we'll do some meta-analysis and we'll ask, are there, does growth form seem to explain some of this? Do agricultural environments or wild environments or habitat, there wasn't, we saw nothing, but there really wasn't, there aren't enough examples to give us a lot of power for that kind of analysis. The notion that, like, I kind of got into this in the first place, I was working on wild tobacco, and I had read a paper. I was the reviewer for a paper in PNAS about their question was whether or not jasminates, methyl jasminate, was an important plant hormone. And it's now well recognized as, this plant hormone that essentially all plant species have, and it does all kinds of things, and there's a ton of work. But this was really one of the very early papers considering the possibility that methyl jasminate could be a plant hormone. And this was done by a group of workers in Washington who had spent their entire careers working with tomato plants. And so they knew all about the biochemistry of tomato, and they somehow also knew that sagebrush was a mega producer of this methyl jasminate stuff that they thought might be a hormone. Who knows how they knew that, but they did. They knew this sort of trivial fact, and so they took sagebrush branches and incubated them in those old vacuum jars. This was in 1990 with potted tomato plants. And the potted tomato plants that were incubated with clipped sagebrush started producing more of these chemicals that they knew were associated with resistance in tomato plants. And so I was the reviewer for this, and it was like, like I'm a field guy. This is very cool, but sagebrush, tomato pot, cultivated tomato plants, these things they never co-occur in nature. Like, yeah, I like this story, but I'm not sure it tells us much about how nature works, kind of was my response. But it was still, like a really good paper for what it was attempting to do. And I was working on wild tobacco at the time, and I'm like stepping over all these sagebrush plants because sagebrush is always its nearest neighbor. Oh, I love that smell. And at some point I thought, oh, wow, hey, tobacco and tomato, they're closely related. I read a paper, something like this. I wonder if wild tobacco will become more resistant when it gets these chemicals. And it did. The first hint that I had of this kind of communication was between sagebrush and tobacco, which kind of, I still think, what's going on there? Like, that doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to me. It could be that sagebrush produces all this methyljasminate, and everybody responds to that. But people have told me, I don't understand this argument. People have told me that that's unlikely, that the concentrations are wrong. So there's communication that is very general, like between species, between sagebrush and wild tobacco. So something really general. And then there's also like this specificity about like you have to be of the same chemotype for it to really work. You have to be, you communicate most effectively with yourself rather than wait a minute. There's both like this very general communication going on and also like really, really specific component to it. And I don't know how to make sense of that. Ooh, that was a long-winded answer. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. Potentially silly question, but thank you for this talk. It's super thought-provoking. I have a speech pathology background, so I think a lot about language in the human domain, and I'm just wondering if there's when I think about communication, I'm thinking about functions of communication, and also that for the the sender receiving a message, there's like a bit of vagueness like inherent in that, and then the receiver like interpreting that message can make choices about like what it means for them. Idiosyncratically. And I'm wondering if plants, do they ever get it wrong? So if they receive communication, maybe instead of increasing defenses, they decrease defenses. Is there any sort of like misunderstanding, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know if it's misunderstanding or if they've like kind of understood the cue correctly, but then there are lots of examples of induced responses that are counterproductive. And a lot of insects actually take advantage of this. So there are insects that are that are providing the wrong cues and getting the plant to respond to things other than them. And there are trade-offs in the responses that the plants can make, so that they are essentially giving the plants misinformation. The plant then reduces its defenses against that insect. And yeah, there are a bunch of not a bunch, but there are some like really cool examples that kind of thing.
That is the end of our official Q&A, but please, I know a lot of us have more questions. Right? So please do come to coffee if you have time. Thank you so much.